Dr. Grady, a popular theologian has recently claimed that the real elephant in the room, apparently, is the flood story. He has scoffed, like many anti-young earth creationists, he has scoffed at the Bible's account of the entire world being covered by water in a global catastrophic flood event. He says this is indefensible scientifically and historically. And so what I want to do is prove this theologian, William Lane Craig, wrong on his assertions.
See, the real elephant in the room here is the flood story. It's not Adam and Eve, it's the flood, because it is scientifically indefensible to think that within the span of human history, that all of the world's terrestrial life was wiped out in a flood, except for that aboard the ark. That is indefensible scientifically, historically, and linguistically.
This individual, William Lane Craig, in his video, he said just scientifically, it's indefensible that all life was killed on the earth and the whole earth was covered. There's no scientific evidence for it. You've provided a few really good lines of evidence, Dr. Grady, but that question, if posed to a creationist, that there's just absolutely no evidence, it's indefensible, how can we best respond, Dr.
Well, of course, William Lane Craig doesn't know his head from a hole in the ground when it comes to science. That's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
Theoretically, he's a theologian. I'm both. I have doctorates in both science and theology. But the fact of the matter is that when we take a look, again, at massive fossil graveyards, such as at Hell's Creek out west, when we take a look at the disarticulation of creatures, which would be because their dead bodies are being disarticulated in torrential currents, the burying of wet mud layers. We talk about polystrate fossils, and of course, most of us would think in terms of tree trunks, baby bones. But the fact of the matter is that almost any fossil is a polystrate fossil if it's something more than a single-celled organism. You take a look at the layers such as at the Grand Canyon or equivalent places such as down in Namibia, for instance, and you see all these layers, and evolution will tell you this is slow and gradual accumulation. But when you think about it and look at it, you'll see that they undulate, that they are folded. This could only happen if all those layers came into existence at the same time and were folded by tectonic forces while they were still wet. If they were all perfectly flat, there wouldn't be any of these undulations, these deformations, because if there were any movement, then the rocks would be broken. But they're not, for long stretches. And again, if you take a look at the idea that when you see layers, often there's hundreds and hundreds of layers of the same material that make up a whole section. Now, when you see those layers, it's not just one layer. It could be 10 layers, 100 layers, and they're almost always of the same thickness within each band. Now, if you were to think that was slow and gradual accumulation, you would have to believe in some cases that you would have 10 or 100 floods of exactly the same depth over exactly the same surface, supposedly over hundreds of thousands of years. Well, that would stretch credulity just by chance. But the folding and that the layers are not in the order shown in the textbook, generally speaking. Now, I know of 26 locations on the Earth where there are some of the layers in the order that are shown in the textbooks in the geological time scale, which is the Bible of the evolutionist. However, there's not that many layers in those locations, but sometimes, and of course, even by random chance, you'd expect to find some in the same order as sections of it. But what you find is the layers are upside down; they're missing. There's the folding. There's the again, polystrate fossils of all kinds. There are so many things about these layers that do not possibly fit with the evolutionary story. It just debunks it completely. I have a photo taken out in the British Columbian Rockies. It's an official Canadian government photograph. In the top of the Canadian Rockies in British Columbia there, you see massive, massive, tight folding. And in some cases, you even say whole layers that are parallel to each other, just as you would kind of expect them, except they're not horizontal, they're vertical. Now, how could they be pushed into a vertical position, maintaining the integrity of the parallel layers? Unless it's mud, it's being folded, and that the whole section was block faulted and tilted up. And so in this one Canadian government photograph, it's your government,
That's right.
you know, on the one side, you'll see, I don't know, probably 15, 20 layers that are just perfectly flat and parallel with each other, as you would expect in the ground, but they're not horizontal, they're vertical.
Wow.
And immediately next to that, you have this very, very tight folding. That can only be done by a worldwide flood with tectonic forces causing these layers to be pushed around, in some cases by whole blocks, in other cases, the layers were laid down flat but then folded like an accordion. Again, I would point out the anomalies that we find in these layers. We find human artifacts, human footprints. We find human tools in layers that, according to evolutionists, would predate humans in their thinking of how humans evolved from some primate, but predate them by hundreds of millions of years and predate dinosaurs by up to 300 million years, according to the evolutionary religion, because it's religion, it's not science.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so much there, Dr. Grady. A significant point you made at first. You're both a theologian and a scientist.
Scientist first, and an evolutionist first.
Yeah, right. You've been there.
I've been on both sides. That's why I'm a formidable opponent.
That's right. And so it can be frustrating when you hear a theologian, someone like William Lane Craig, make that assertion that it's just indefensible, but clearly they're not up to date with the scientific evidence that you're doing such a good job presenting to us right now. Because how would they really address those points? I'd like to ask this, Dr. Grady. So in light of what you're saying, if I'm understanding correctly, you have these sedimentary rock layers that just extend over entire continents and beyond.
In some cases, hundreds of thousands of square miles.
Wow.
In the central part of the United States, roughly from our Midwest, kind of towards you, all the way out to our Southwest, we have contiguous layers that go for more than 1,000 miles. And then you take a look at how the extent, top, bottom, east, west, and so forth. The idea that could be generated by floods of equal depth multiple times so perfectly is impossible. Now, when we do look at sedimentation studies that have been done at sedimentary laboratories at the Colorado State University or in France, we have absolute proof that even in a vacuum, different size granules will form layers. But that in moving water, all of the layers form at the same time and continue to grow in the direction of water flow. I would suggest you could easily go on the internet. I have pictures of it included in my videos of what's called the wave out in Arizona. And in that one section, you see almost every kind of sedimentation that you can see, including folding, shearing, cross-hatching. It's amazing in just a one photograph that you can see the layers were being laid down, that they are also being folded, and then they were sheared off completely, and then the other layers laid down on top of that. And I have photos from all over the world, quite literally. And these are of layers that are upside down, backwards, entire mountain ranges that are upside down. I mean, Matterhorn is a real scare for a geologist who believes in evolution. But it doesn't matter where we look. We see these layers out of order. And again, in Canada, I have pictures from up there. But all these mountain ranges, if you think in terms of evolution, these layers should be oldest on the bottom, youngest on the top, right? I mean, that's what you expect from the evolutionary interpretation. But the fact of the matter is they're not. They're often upside down, missing. Again, the Grand Canyon is supposedly 500 million years of layers. 140 is missing just to start with. And so it's not a perfect record. And while, again, there are places where the layers can be found in the order shown in the textbooks, the entire column cannot be. I have another little number for you if you want to, think about it. If you were to accept the evolutionary view of slow and gradual accumulation of these layers over time, first of all, remember that this would require many, many floods, and they would have to be at least continental in size, if you don't want to believe in global. But when you take a look at these things, and then you find all of the foldings and the bendings and all that other jazz. The shearings are very obvious. You can drive down a road where they had a road cut and see all the stuff I'm talking about in a minor version. But again, you have the artifacts in them. You have so many things that contradict slow and gradual that the person who believes in slow and gradual is doing it only by faith. It's religion. It's not science.
Yeah, my thinking in light of what you're saying is, and you mentioned it there, that those who deny a global flood, they have to say, well, we've had many local floods over time, not at the same time, but over time, forming these geologic features and layers. But with what you're saying, no, I mean, if these layers and features are extending over entire continents in some instances, then that would have to, and they match, you can correlate some of these mega sequences, then that would have to be a single catastrophic event creating those roughly at the same time. Is that right, Dr. Grady?
Yes, and we have talked about this before in the program too, that science, and I point out in Bible study, the two most important questions in science, and I was a scientist before I also became a theologian. I was an evolutionist before I became a creationist. But when you take a look at all these layers, and again, hundreds, thousands of layers, and in, like I say, whole bands where it's the same material but different layers, but all the same kind of material, you have to ask yourself, okay, that's what's there. But then ask yourself the question, what's not there? Because
Right.
in science, those are the two most important questions in science. So when I make a scientific observation, I must, accurately describe what is present. I have to describe it correctly, accurately. But then you ask yourself the question, what's not there? Because we learn more by asking the second question than the first. And the same thing is true of Bible study. I mean, I could give you multiple illustrations. But when you think about it, all those layers, if they are supposed to be slow and gradual accumulation, if they're supposed to be one layer of exactly the same material laid down, let's say an inch thick, and then covered by another layer exactly the same material, 1 inch thick, and again and again and again, then each of those layers supposedly would have been exposed before the next layer was put down. Then why are there no soil horizons? Why are there no V-shaped erosion marks? Why are there no animal holes? Why are there no root holes? Which is what should be there if the evolutionists has given us the correct interpretation.
Wow. Those are some great questions. I would love to see somebody like William Lane Craig answer in a sophisticated manner. Those are some tough challenges right there.
I can assure you he couldn't answer them.
No, he couldn't.
He would simply deny them.
So, okay, a big challenge that more informed evolutionists like to put forth, and it seems like you've debunked it in many ways because the rock record is not as neat and orderly as they like to put forth in the textbooks. But they'll say, well, if there was a year-long worldwide flood event, then all these fossils that we find, they should be more scrambled, because they'll look to the lower layers and then the top layers and say we got progressive evolution from fish to fishermen, basically. And so what would be a good way to engage that argument from the ordering of the fossil record, Dr. Grady?
Well, again, of course, we don't deny that a lot of the fossils are in that evolutionary order because, supposedly as life evolved, they got sea life first, and then sea life crawled onto the land, right? I mean, that's general order. And we don't deny that you find tremendous trillions of seashells and sea life in the lower layers. But this is exactly what you expect to find in a worldwide flood, too. After all, clams don't have legs. They're going to get buried alive. I would ask the question, why do we find clams in layers with T-Rexes, though?
Right.
So you see that mixing that does not have consistency with the evolutionary thought process. They show you the T-Rex, but they don't show you the seashell that was found next to it. They don't want you to know about that.
Or all the mammal species that coexisted with the dinosaurs.
Well, and they're having to admit that there were more mammals in the record with the reptiles than that reptiles aren't pre-mammals.
Yeah, right.
They find a lot of inconsistencies there, and they're finally starting to agree that that's true. But I was talking about the layers, and if you think about it, if you could take the thickest layer of any one of the layers, you take the thickest layer of the Cambrian and the thickest layer of the Silurian and that you could find anywhere in the world, and then that would supposedly represent the maximum amount of time for accumulation of that layer, correct? Conceptually, just a thought exercise. Because if you found less than the maximum amount, you could simply say, well, part of it had eroded away after deposition, correct? And so the thickest layer would presumably represent the longest period of time for accumulation of that layer during the quote evolutionary process. And if you bring them all to one place and then stack them on one on top of the other, then the stack of layers would be 76 miles high. The problem is the average thickness of all the layers in the world everywhere is only 1.2 miles. Now that means there's 74.8 miles missing. I think that's a little bit of a challenge to get over.
Absolutely.
And again, the layers are not in the right order. You've got the polystrate fossils, you've got the missing evidence, you've got the evidence that ought not to be there, but is. The list becomes overwhelming.
And then you mentioned earlier these stratification experiments, these flume experiments.
Right.
If I understand correctly, where you got these layers formed rapidly in real time, we can observe it.
We've actually seen them being formed and laid down, and then the only thing that has to happen is to remove the water and they'll lithify into rock. But I can't do it with my hands, but all the layers form at the same time. But there's a diagonal front edge. Okay, so as the water's flowing this way, and you've got muddy water, and that muddy water has different size grains. Then as the water's moving in one direction, the mud is also moving in the same direction. And there's sort of a diagonal front. And it goes this way, that the layers are all formed at the same time. Therefore, the layer at the bottom is the same age as the layer at the top. It's not older or younger.
So a fossil, these layers are forming horizontally,
right,
based on the moving water, the way that the
in the direction of water flow, right?
And so you could have a fossil that's lower in a lower layer, the same
make
age,
it older than the one at the top.
Wow. Yeah, and so that goes against all their ideas about the laws of superposition. Then, if
exactly, it's meaningless. Now, again, we don't deny that there's a general order in the layers,
right,
with the mammals towards the top, let's say, the birds towards the top. But that would be what you'd expect in a worldwide flood too. That the creatures that either could not move, like clams and oysters and mussels and so forth, are going to get buried where they are. Period. The trilobites living underwater are going to get buried. And it's really, some of the fossils of trilobites are really intriguing. It turns out that they often traveled one right behind the other in a series, like a locomotive with a train behind it. But that they are slow moving. They don't have long legs. So you would expect them to be buried first by rising muddy water. But of course, the creatures that had more intelligence and had more mobility, you know, the longer the legs and the more the intelligence, shall we say, are going to try to keep from being drowned. So they're going to move upland. But because of tidal tsunamis, because of the flooding, it isn't like water rising in a bathtub. Because of the position of sun, moon, rotation of the earth,
Right.
there are going to be times when the water is going to rise, shall we say, faster in a location. But then because of a lower tide, then it's going to go back down. And then when you think about the dinosaur nests of eggs that we have found and the tracks that we have found, the trackways, I think it's very interesting, as a matter of fact, that one of the major trackways is along the east side of the American Rockies, and most of them are heading north towards Canada because that's where the higher ground was at the time. And these dinosaurs, they are dumb reptiles. Reptiles are just dumb to begin with. But again, they're also slow. They don't have stamina. They have speed in quick bursts, but because of their hearts and lungs and so forth, the way they are, they're not like horses. They can't run. They can run very fast for 100 feet, but they can't run very fast for a mile. And so what's going to happen? The faster the creature, the more intelligent the creature, its ability to get to higher ground as the waters are rising is one reason why, though we have found humans that drowned in the flood or found their bones or artifacts, etc., they're very rare. I mean, very rare. And one of the reasons is because they're some of the last to die. They're going to drown on the surface. When creatures drown on the surface, they don't necessarily get buried. They're going to disarticulate quickly. You've got creatures that are in the water that are looking for lunch, frankly. And so, yes, there should be a general order from shellfish to people in the record as you go up. So the concept of this superposition in a very mild sense would be true, but that does not have anything to do with the age.
Excellent points. I've spoken to several geologists that say in the field, when they're looking for fossils, consistently they find what? Mixed environments, sharks mixed with land creatures, mixed with plants. That's
what speaks of a worldwide flood.
Mm-hmm.
The water is moving this material around. And so it stirs things up, it mixes things up. That's why I say they want to show you the T-Rex, but they don't want to show you the shellfish that was buried with it.
Right.
Which shows the mixing of a marine environment with a terrestrial environment, which is indicative of a worldwide flood. It cannot be by local flood.